Welcome back to episode 6 of Project RS125, where the jobs continue to go ahead. But a big one today is seeing if I can restore this frame at home. It had gone massively pitted, so we've ordered up some products and we're going to see how we can get on with a DIY. But first things first, we're going to need to clear the bits and bobs off the ramp just to make sure we've got some room to see a little sample piece come to light. The RS125 has a lovely looking frame out the factory. Unfortunately, mine had gone heavily oxidised, which means it had corroded and there was lots of pitting in it. And I really wanted to know if I could restore this at home myself with just some general products that could be purchased over the counter. But what we did need to do was just mark off a sample piece just so I could see a before and after, and then start working through the wet and dry to hopefully get a nice result. That's the first pass completed with some 800 wet and dry, and I've essentially just got water in there, and as hopefully you can see in the camera, it's getting most of it out, especially where you look there, you can see the sort of pitting, it's gone there. I mean, I could go a little bit more aggressive, but I'm kind of liking not going too mad because it hasn't actually destroyed the finish. So I believe this has got like a clear coat on it, so we're going to need to get through that anyway. But this is again just reading online, so I'm going to have a play with this section. I'll put the masking tape here so that we can sort of get a before and after comparison. Hopefully it will look better with the other bits we've got on the bench, but yeah, I'm just going to weigh up whether I go a little bit more aggressive and then start working up the grade. So potentially go with like a 400, then back to an 800, then a 1200. I can't even remember what's in that multi-pack there. What have we got? Yeah, 800, then 1200, quite a jump to be fair. And then we'll hit it with a polisher and some metal polish and see if we can actually get a bit of a shine on this. But I am liking the brush look as well. I'm not against that, if I'm honest. But yeah, I think we've got to polish it, haven't we, really? RS125 traditional look. As mentioned, I work my way through the wet and dry grades, essentially 400 being the more coarse and then right up to 1200, which is a smoother variant. Obviously we're still going to have some sanding marks in there, but this easily removes the corrosion, preparing us for the metal polish. Now ready for some polishing. I mean, I'm not a big metalworking guy. I just grabbed some Auto Sol from my local Halfords. The reviews look pretty good on it. I'm armed with a dual action polisher, which is really built for bodywork rather than metal, especially the compounds and the pads. They're not suited to this sort of work. But as you'll hopefully see here, it actually worked out pretty well and certainly saved me some elbow grease using the machine polisher. Unfortunately, it did chew through the pads, but unfortunately, we are going to have to live with it. They are available online pretty cheaply, so I wasn't too concerned about going through 3 or 4 overall, but this did allow me, like I say, to really speed up the process. Well, I've got to say, that looks absolutely fantastic, especially compared to the horrible core side with like no reflection in it versus, and I've given that, what, 15 minutes attention, 20 minutes attention? I mean, obviously there's a whole frame there. It's not going to be 2 minutes to finish it, but wow, that shows you the potential. I mean, like all this that you're going to be looking at when you're on the bike looks disgusting. And then that, I've still got a few little sanding marks in there, so I probably need to bring up the coarse level a little bit higher to like 1500 maybe, just so it's prepped better. But yeah, that harder pad, I mean, it was a body compound pad, so it's not really designed for metal, but yeah, that's worked wonderfully, and can't wait to see that on the rest of the bike now. But yeah, we know that works. I mean, it wasn't not going to work, but I was just wondering if I'm going to be able to do it at home, which Yeah, I certainly am, but we need to strip the best of the bike down and give me some more access to polish this all up. So as mentioned, I'm happy with how the test on the frame is going. We're going to need to start stripping the bike down to really get into all those awkward areas. So I'll remove the radiator and then I move on to removing the engine brackets, the wiring loom, just all the odds and sods. So it's essentially just a bare frame that we can begin to work with. A good chunk of parts removed there, the radiator's out, the battery bracket, the old cruddy hose which is all like fused to the radiator, the ignition barrel, obviously the lovely RS125 clocks, all the brackets for the engine, I mean there's all sorts, the splitter there as well which goes from the throttle to the oil pump and to the carb. We've got all the wiring loom there which we're going to have to strip down and simplify, the side stand, and man, the head bearings on this, I mean with technology now you can't really experience it. Imagine in 10 years you'll be able to put a set of goggles on and you'll be able to smell and feel everything I'm doing in the workshop with the powers of YouTube. But these are gone. There's like a pinch point at 12 o'clock. Hopefully when we knock the bearings out, we'll be able to see that. But that must have been absolutely awful to ride because they've been like that for a while. You can feel there's a proper pinch there and it breaks out of it. It must have been murder for it to turn for a bike that normally handles so sweet. But yeah, that's onto the swing arm now. With the rear wheel removed, I needed a way to support the frame to take the swing arm off. The problem is, because the paddock stand was holding on the swing arm, it was just going to make things a real pain. So I decided, after a few beers and thinking about it, to use some axle stands and a little bit of 8mm stud and some nuts to build a contraption to try and hold the frame in place, which would later come in handy for washing it and the machine polishing. So yeah, I'm going to have to patent this super good idea, and hopefully no drama unfolds of it falling off at a later stage while I'm working on the bike. It's then on to removing the rear linkage and damper. Now, as mentioned, the damper looks pretty gone for, unfortunately, leaking, but not a big issue because we've got that new YSS unit to go in place. But everything is pretty tight as it's not been moved for many years. But thankfully, I managed to get everything out without consulting the angle grinder. With the old swing arm removed, you can see the true state of it. Grease, grime, heavily pitted, like anything savable, but hours and hours could be spent there. And obviously standard shock doesn't look fantastic either. Looks in quite a state, to be honest with you. But yeah, we've got the donor swing arm, which is a million times better. It's got new bushes in it. All the linkage has been restored, and we've got that YSS shock as well. So the frame now just needs to have these last little bits taken off of it. The head bearings are obviously completely shot, so we'll knock those out as well. And then just need to take it outside and degrease all this stuff. It's not on show, but as we're at this stage, we might as well get it cleaned up properly so it's at least half decent when it goes back together. It was finally time to have a look at those nasty head bearings. Now normally I have a suitable C-spanner for undoing these, but God knows where it is. So in this episode you get to see me use a punch followed by some mole grips to remove it. And to be honest with you, it works really well, but if it was on a bike I was really precious about, I'd definitely want to do a C-spanner on it to save you damaging that locking nut. Using the same trusty punch, I knock out the old head bearings. I've got no interest in trying to save these, and to be fair, I would never reuse a set of head bearings anyway, given the cost, so these were simply knocked out and removed from the frame. Before taking the frame outside to be tackled with the trusty Auto Clean engine degreaser, I thought, you know what, it's probably best to try and tackle this with some brake and clutch cleaner. It's definitely a stronger formula, and as you can see here, it certainly removes a lot of grime that had been on there for some time. The only final things to do before we can go outside for this deep clean, firstly is removing the ID plate. Thankfully this is simply held in with 2 rivets which can be pretty easily drilled out, And yeah, as you can see, quite a bit of grime behind there, so I'm glad we're removing that to give it a thorough polish behind the plate as well. And then the final step is the stickers that come on there from factory, something to do with the material it's constructed with, the weight, but essentially once those stickers are removed, you can see how the original finish once upon a time was, but sadly it's not like that anymore. But don't worry, we're going to try and get it back there in the next couple of minutes. It's the moment I have been waiting for. The frame is stripped down, we're armed with Auto Glim's engine bay degreaser. It's time to get the grime off. And this is a really exciting stage, not only for the satisfaction of getting the bike clean, but also because it means after this, the bike is going to start going back together, which is good news. It's what I wanted to do. I'm so excited to have that trip down memory lane and get this bike back on the road, which I think I'm going to try and aim for August time. Let's see provisionally if I can get it done. And obviously we are going to need to get the bike insured. And for those of you who watch the channel know, I'm proudly a part of the affiliation scheme with BeMoto Insurance. So if you're looking for your next motorcycle policy, why not click the link in the description and see what they can do for you. Trusty Nilfisk pressure washer blasts away all that grime and the engine bay degreaser, and I must admit it does look pretty good on there, especially as it has literally just been degreased. It's not like I've put any wet and dry to it or any sort of alloy treatment. It doesn't look actually too bad at all, which is a pleasant surprise. I think that's probably because a lot of that grease and grime actually kept it preserved in there, but hey ho, we've still got a lot of work to do to bring that back to former glory. With the frame back in the workshop and left to dry, within a few hours it was ready to go back on the bench, and some new parts have started to arrive. Firstly, the head bearings from SKF. Pretty decent brand, but a little tip is to bang them in the freezer before installation to help them contract as much as possible, essentially easing installation. But I don't want to get too carried away yet, as it's going to be on to some polishing. I'm going to be honest, I don't envy anyone who does this job for a living or enjoys it. It is, I'm not having fun with this if I'm honest. But that said, it's looking pretty cool in the brushed effect. Obviously we've got that on the R1, which looks really cool on the fuel tank and the swing arm. So yeah, I could easily be swayed to do that with 800 grit. But to be honest with you, I want this thing to pop. It's a little show bike that we're building here, or a show bike that I think is going to be half decent looking. Obviously the frame's not perfect. There are nicks in it that I would have to sand loads down to get rid of. But yeah, I'm really happy with how it's coming along. Again, just not something that I'm enjoying. So hopefully you've appreciated from the time lapse. So this has been taking about 2.5, 3 hours just to get to this stage. So we're now going to go to the 1200 wet and dry. and then it'll be on to polishing. There are bits that I can't get to, like down here, because of obviously where the rig is, but that's fine, because once the bike's built back up, I can do it on there complete. It's just I wanted to get the bulk of it, the difficult accesses, done whilst it was on the bench like this. I'm going to call that a wrap on polishing the frame. Is it perfect? No, far from. And I've learned a lot from this. It's the first time I've really polished something, but does it look a million times better? Well, I think so, especially when you compare it to the swing arm that came off that same bike, that oxidization where it just looked flat and horrible, and now, yeah, night and day. So I've certainly gone through some polishing pads. They weren't really built for the job, they're bodywork pads, so they're not happy with life. Used quite a bit of polish, but I'd probably say 6 hours with the wet and dry went into that, and yeah, game changer compared to how it looked before. So I guess now we can start putting things back together, and we've got that partially swing arm polished from the donor bike. So yeah, I think we'll use that one because this just looks a state, and it's all the bearings are shot. This bad boy's got all new linkages in it. So yeah, let's start putting it back together. So as I'm sure you can appreciate, I'm fed up of wet and dry now, but I know this is a big step forward and it needs to be done to complete the project. As I mentioned earlier, it's not something I'm particularly enjoying, so just keep ploughing through it and tick it off the list. At this point I thought, do you know what, I should probably have a quick look at the donor swing arm. It's already been polished before, so it should be a pretty quick process. The problem is, the more I worked on it, the more I realised, you know what, there is actually some heavy grazes, damage on this that I'm going to need to sand out. And to make matters worse, I even noticed a few snapped off bolts. So I can't rule out using the old one and cleaning that up just yet. A quick look at the head bearing assembly. So ultimately I have bought SKF bearings. Lovely, nice quality stuff. We've got some new seals as well to go on there. And before we get underway, for those that saw earlier, the head bearings were just absolutely shot, and you're probably not going to be able to see it too, actually no, the camera looks like it's picking it up. There are actually little dimples in that bearing shell, and that's what was causing that notchiness, and it can really make a bike handle badly, really badly. It's like a game changer when you replace them and you get back on the bike again. So these were well shot just by the feel, and obviously clearly visible there as well. So what we need to do is remove the other part of the bearing from the bottom yoke and stem assembly. There's a few methods for doing this, but I'll show you one I've done. Proceed at your own risk, and I've essentially put the new bearing shell, so the new version of this, in the freezer to try and contract it as much as possible so it slides into that frame nice and easily. But we will also cut this and use it as sort of a guide for the punch as well, which again I'll show you. So hopefully if you're doing the same job at home, you'll find this interesting and helpful. But you can also see the state of that bearing. It's rusted in there as well. You can see the golden color, and that's, but again, just completely shot. But yeah, let's get to work on restoring stuff. We'll get that evil wire brush out on that, try and make that look brand new again as well. So before we go ahead with my ghetto method of removing the lower race bearings, which I've done many a time, but it does have its risks, so you do need to be careful, I thought, you know what, let's have a look at what's in that Haynes manual, because essentially it claims that with 2 lever bars, some sort of raised item, which I use a bit of timber here, you can simply pop the lower bearing off. Well, I can tell you that was not happening. Whether they did that on a brand new bike on the bench is probably the case, whereas this one that's been on there for many years was having none of it. So we had to resort to a method which includes breaking the ball bearing cage or the roller bearing cage, and then getting the trusty Dremel, or if you're really brave, a grinder. But again, this does come with its risks because you could end up damaging the stem shaft on it. With a cut made on the lower bearing inner case, you can now literally use a lever bar, put a slight twist in there, and hopefully, as in my case, it will just pop, and then you can easily lever bar this out of place. And like I say, you do have to be careful, because if you grind too close to the shaft, obviously you're going to put a mark in it, potentially damage it, which is definitely something you don't want. But for me, I've done it enough that I know how deep to go with this, no pun intended. And then I can get a wire brush, just a soft wire brush on that lower yoke, give it a quick going over, finish it off with some of that auto sole metal polish. And as you can see, it actually looks really smart. Not a polished finish, just a really clean alley look to it, which is exactly what I wanted. Firstly, install the new lower seal, and then the new bearing can go into place. And essentially I use a slightly larger socket than the stem, but smaller than the bearing shell, to just guide this into place with a few taps on the hammer. The problem is we now need to get it down into the lower part of the stem, and this is where it is quite tight, unfortunately. So my tip for this, again following at your own risk, is take the old bearing that we cut apart, cut it completely open, and then you can use this as sort of a guide or a drift to smash the new one into place. Now for me, I ended up putting it in the vise, and then hopefully, as you can see in this video, a few poundings on the hammer gets it nicely seated in place, and we're then ready to get some fresh grease on there. And I just go mad with it here. The more grease, the better. It's going to keep any water out, and it's going to keep it nicely lubricated. So whilst back on the tools, I now take the larger side of the bearing and also put a cut in that, which we'll explain in a second. Also get the wire brush out and treat that lock ring to a little TLC too. Doesn't come up as fantastic as I hoped, but it's clean and it's going to be completely out of sight, covered by the top yoke. Now we're going to install the new bearing shells, and as I mentioned, the reason we put that cut in the old ring is if you didn't and you use it as a drift or a guide, it would actually unfortunately get stuck in the frame. But once you've got that cut in it, it allows it just to easily spring out, and then obviously you can use it on the other side bearing as well, which makes installation really easy without the risk of damaging the bearing itself. With the bearings all fitted, I then cover it in even more grease, and it's time to put everything back together. And as you can see here, it all moves absolutely beautiful. At this stage, if it pinches or it's not rotating freely, you've got a problem and you're going to need to investigate it, because if you leave it, it's going to make the bike handle absolutely awful. But that's it for this episode of Project RS125. As you can see, or hopefully see, what a difference. The frame's looking fantastic, the head bearings are all in. It's now just on to restoring more parts and putting it back together, which brings me on to our next arrival, which has turned up, and that is the fabulous bodywork from GRP1. Oh boy, I was excited to receive this large parcel, and I certainly can't wait for the next episode to show you guys when it's on the bike.